Here's a quick little warm-up before we move on to our fourth and final method for solving quadratic equations. So on this page we are reviewing solving quadratic equations by factoring. So give it a try and come back when you're done. Well, the first example was relatively straightforward. Your two factors are shown there of x plus 5 and x minus 2. And when you did the zero product property on it in this line, you could solve it and say x equals 5, or x equals negative 5 or x equals 2. Remember, you can always plug these results back in to make sure that you get 0 out. But we ran into trouble with the second one. These are whole numbers, but it doesn't work. There are not two factors that when multiplied give me a negative 10, but when I add I get a 2. 5 times 2, well, that's a difference of 3. I can't make that work. And 10 and 1 would be 9 or 11, so I can't make that work. That's what this lesson is about. What do you do when you can't factor it the normal way? Thank goodness math has a solution for that.
X equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. X equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a.
Perhaps you found that last song a little irritating, but the fact of the matter is the song was giving you the quadratic formula. So here it is again.
X equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. X equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a.
The song is catchy if you need it to help you memorize this quadratic formula. Here's the formula that you're going to use, but you can only use it when the equation that you are trying to solve for is currently in standard quadratic form. The a's, b's, and c's that you see in this formula are coming from the a's, b's, and c's that are the coefficients in that standard quadratic form. So on this slide, I have listed the steps to using the quadratic equation. Again, your first job is to write your quadratic equation out in standard form. Ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Write down your values of a, b, and c. Plug those into the quadratic formula, which I've listed here until you've memorized it, but you will be expected to memorize it. My strong advice is to compute the numbers under the square root. This is the number one place where people mess up their calculations. You're going to split your equation into the positive and negative solution, and that will make more sense when I do a problem with you, but notice you have the plus and minus here. That's in front of the root. Remember, roots have positive and negative values. And then we're going to solve. So let's get started with this trinomial I have listed here, already in standard quadratic form. Your first job is to list your values of a, b, and c. A is the number that comes before x squared, and since it's not written, it is a 1. B is a 2, and c is a negative 10. Now we can start with our quadratic formula. It's really important to start it with x equals, otherwise you don't really know what you're doing. X equals, those are our solutions, so we're finding them right now using this formula. The formula says it's the opposite of b. Well, that's a negative 2. Plus or minus the square root of b squared. Be careful, I advise you almost always use parentheses there, because if there's a negative, those parentheses will matter. Minus 4, and that's always there. Your value of a is 1, and your value of c was a negative 10. All over 2 times, what was a? 1. Now it just comes to calculating on your calculator. I'm going to leave the negative 2 there, and the plus or minus, and the square root for now, and this 2 downstairs. And I'm going to calculate the value underneath my radical. 2 squared is 4. And then when you take, in fact, on your calculator, just put this whole part in. 2 squared minus 4 times 1 times a negative 10. So you're going to get 4 plus 40. Well, that's 44. Now I advise you find the square root of 44. And rewrite your whole equation. So you'll have negative 2 plus or minus 6 point, we'll stick with the hundredths place, 6/3 all over 2. Well, there's really 2 equations in there. One is the equation where you're adding the 6.63, and the other equation is where you are subtracting the 6.63. Remember, quadratics usually have 2, so that shouldn't be weird. Then you go up and you clean these up. So you have a negative 2 plus 6.63, and it's super important to hit the equal sign after that, or your calculator will do your order of operations wrong. So if you do your order of operations right, you're going to get a 2.32. On the other side, I'll take a negative 2 minus 6.63, and then divide that by 2 after you hit the equal sign, and you will get negative 4.32. So there are your 2 solutions. That would explain why you couldn't just factor them easily. They were decimals, and that happens a lot. All right, we're going to do some more examples. Now pay attention to what I'm about ready to say. If we would have had to factor a trinomial like that, we would have been unhappy because of that 2 right there. It makes it where we have to factor the hard way. But the secret I'm going to tell you is that this quadratic formula right here always works to factor or solve a quadratic. So you can always use the quadratic formula in place of any method you've learned previously, which is pretty cool. Another little thing I want to tell you before I get started on solving this one is to recognize this part of the quadratic formula. X equals negative b over 2a. That's not the first time you've seen that. You saw that back when we had to graph in standard quadratic form. This was our axis of symmetry. So it's pretty cool. This is where our axis of symmetry equation came from, the negative b over 2a. So it might make memorizing it just a little bit easier. Alright, so identify our a, b, and c in this equation. A is 2, b is 4, and c is a negative 7. Next is to fill in the formula. The opposite of b is a negative 4. Here's our plus and minus because we have a square root coming up. 4 squared, because b is 4, minus the 4 times a times c, all over 2 times a. Again, follow my advice and make the first thing you calculate the thing under the radical. So you should get a 72 when you do that, and if you don't, come find someone because you're doing something weird with your calculator. And then that's over 4. So now you're going to have 2 equations to write out, and we can kind of get started on that right now. So I'm going to do negative 4 plus, and here's where I'm going to take the square root of 72, and you get 8.49. And that will be eventually all divided by 4. And then you have your second equation hidden in there, which is your subtraction of 8.49 all over 4. So let's do the first equation. You're going to take your negative 4 plus your 8.49 and hit the equal sign, and then divide by 4 to get 1.12. Your other solution, you have your negative 4, this time your minus 8.49, hit the equal sign, divide by 4, and get negative 3.12. Your 2 solutions, or your 2 x-intercepts, if you want to think about it like that, for this quadratic equation. Alright, here's your guided practice. Remember, your first step is to write down what a, b, and c are, use the formula, and calculate it using the tricks I gave you. Pause the video now and come back when you're done. If you did not get those two answers, my first suspicion would be to look at the square root of hopefully 577. All right, a couple more situations you might encounter. This one doesn't have it here, but if your equation was not in standard quadratic, you would need to get it in standard quadratic. So if you had a number over here, you would have to collect all your terms on one side to get it in standard quadratic form. This one, though, is quite straightforward. So go ahead and use the quadratic formula on it, pause the video, and come back. And here are those solutions, x equals 3 or x equals 5. And in fact, because they're whole numbers, it pretty much tells you you could have used the factoring method on this one up here. You would have gotten x plus 5 and x minus 3. But then as soon as you use, oops, that tells me I've meant my negative 5 there, the factoring method would have worked as well. Which leads us to the review of the three methods we have learned. We've learned to factor, we learned the quadratic formula, and graphing. We also learned the square root method, but again, if we have a middle term, that won't work. So square root method would not work on this equation right here, but factoring and the quadratic formula and graphing would, and I'd like you to do these quickly using the three different methods because it'll be super cool what you notice at the end. So pause the video and challenge your skills and do this one equation, solving it with the following three methods. So let's go through all three of these. When we solved it by factoring, we ended up with x equals 4 or x equals negative 2. And those were the same solutions when we did the quadratic formula, which should not be a surprise. But going back to graphing, which is a great review, I found the axis of symmetry, and then I found the vertex at 1 and negative 9. I picked another point because I needed more information. So I substituted 0 into the equation and got negative 8 out. And then when you made your parabola, you should notice that it pretty much goes through x equals 4 and x equals negative 2. So again, your x-intercepts are the same things as your solutions, and your solutions can be found through factoring or the quadratic formula. If you wanted another example, you could go ahead and do this one, and of course all three of the answers should match up and be the same.
X equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. X equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac